Welcome to Short Course, episode 105 for June 16th, 2023. I'm your host, Ben Barry. It is 2 weeks. Tomorrow will be 2 weeks from our baby's due date, and he has not yet come. So things have been interesting around our house. I actually took last week off from the show because I didn't have a topic ready. I didn't expect to have to talk to anything. But this week, voting started, and so I figured I should hop on the podcast and talk about a few things. The first thing I wanted to address is the nature of the Area 6 election and how USPSA bylaws dictate that elections should run more generally. So I've talked about this before, but I want to reiterate it for this specific purpose. So the bylaws state that you can have as many people as you want in an initial election, and if no one person gets 50% of the vote, then the top two vote getters go to a runoff. So in the case of the Area 6 election, that actually makes things pretty straightforward. No matter how things go, if no one of the three of us, myself, Kyle Stevens, or Matt Hopkins, if no one of the three of us gets 50% of the vote, then the top two will go into a runoff. And so basically you can vote for whoever you want in the first round, and if whoever you voted for doesn't make it into the runoff, then you can vote for someone else in the second round. And this is really the best case scenario for this format of runoff voting. And I would say it's really the only scenario that doesn't lead to bad outcomes, in the sense that if there were a fourth person in the election, so let's say Bruce Wells had decided to run for re-election, there would have been a significant chance that Matt Hopkins and I could have split the group of people who, on average, are likely to vote for one of the two of us, because I think in the general spectrum of things, he and I are fairly closely aligned. And so there would actually be a non-zero chance that by splitting that vote, neither of us would make it to the runoff. And in this hypothetical scenario, Bruce and Kyle would have ended up in the runoff. And I actually, I thought through that, and I am glad that we didn't have to figure out how to handle that. I think basically if that had happened, one of us, Matt or I, should have dropped out. Luckily, it didn't happen. And so things work out just fine. There's no sort of game theory at play there. Now, I've said before, and I'll say it again, one simple fix for this would just be to go to ranked choice voting, which I think honestly would probably be healthier for the sport in a lot of ways. Like I said, voting opened today, and I think people are good-naturedly trying to say who to vote for, saying who they voted for. But there is a sort of divisiveness of, hey, I voted for this guy, you voted for that guy, can we still be friends? I mean, obviously it's a bit of a caricature. I hope nobody really loses any sleep over this. But there is an element of, hey, these two candidates are both good candidates. I'm just going to rank them 1 and 2, and you might rank them in the opposite order, but they're still both the top of our list. And I mean, for those of you not aware, ranked choice voting, ranked choice voting is actually a big umbrella that covers a number of options, including instant runoff voting. But basically the idea is you have a list of candidates and you just number them. You say, this is my first choice, this is my second choice, this is my third choice. And you don't have to give everybody a number. You can leave some people blank. And the short version of how it's run is that if your first choice is the least popular candidate after all the first round votes are tallied, then that candidate is eliminated and your vote then goes to your second choice. And this just keeps going until somebody has 50% of the vote. And it basically removes all kinds of downsides and weird outcomes for election and strategic voting and that sort of thing, which, I mean, is real. I mean, there's a 7-way presidential election, and to some degree, in a secret ballot vote, you are encouraged to vote strategically. And if there is somebody that you are worried is going to be on the bubble who might not make the runoff, but you want to vote for some dark horse outsider candidate, then you basically have to choose. Do you want to vote for the person who you think has a chance of making the runoff, or do you want to vote for the person that you really think would be the best choice? And so in a ranked choice voting setup, you would just, make the dark horse outsider your number 1, and then if they got eliminated, then your vote would go to the number 2. Because we don't have that and we have a 7-way presidential election, which really, like I said, this runoff system is really only works well. It really doesn't it only doesn't have downsides with 3 people in the election. So that's regrettable. But the bylaws stipulate that this is how the election has to be run. that it's this runoff format, and ranked choice voting is not an option. The board could not choose it. They would have to amend the bylaws, which I would be on board with. No pun intended. I think that would be a good positive change in the future, and just generally encourage people to run more, because outsider candidates would have a little bit more of a chance. And also I think it would make the voting process somewhat less divisive. So I don't really see a downside to it aside from the complexity, which is always kind of a startup cost type of thing. So you'd have to have the explanations and whatnot for people for the first time through. But anyway, the whole reason I bring this up is Area 6, because it's a three-way election, the way the runoff is structured, you can vote for whoever you want, and if that person is eliminated, then you can get a second vote in the runoff. So no worries there. Vote for whoever your first pick is, and then you'll get a second chance at the runoff. And according to the bylaws, the timeline is something like this. The bylaws talk about a lot of 15 and 30 days, but then there's one that's 31 days. But the general idea is the election will run until the middle of July, and then it'll be 15 days after the election ends that the results are delivered. So that'll basically be the end of July. Then 15 days after that, the middle of August, the election firm is notified that we will need a runoff. So Area 6 might have a runoff, probably will have a runoff. The president definitely will have a runoff. So August 15th, middle of August-ish, the firm will be notified. Then they have 30 days to prepare. So the actual voting for the runoff will begin middle of September. Again, from my reading of the bylaws, it will run for another month. So middle of October, the voting will end. And then there's another 15-day period for the election firm to tabulate the results and deliver them. So end of October is when we should get the results. There's a little bit of leeway maybe with the board being able to move some of those dates up a little bit, but probably not. Either way, it'll be one combined runoff for the area election and the president, which is only relevant to people in Area 6 because Area 8 is a two-way election, so there will be no runoff there. But I just wanted to kind of get that on people's radar that almost certainly Area 6 will be going to a runoff. There definitely will be a runoff, if for nothing else, than the president. So keep your eyes peeled around the middle of September for that second ballot, which at that point will just be two candidates for either one or two elections. And while we are on the topic of runoffs and bylaws weirdness, the current state is that Yi-Min Lin, his discipline was upheld, and so the board put out a statement saying that this was a resignation when he was, forcefully resigned. He was resigned by default, but calling it a resignation sounds better, so that's what they're labeling it. But it was a pretty long statement, but basically buried in it, it said they had given him some terms, and if he had accepted the terms, he would not have lost his RO cert, but presumably the terms were intolerable for whatever reason, and he declined that, and his RO cert was taken away. In the minutes for the May 31st, 2023 meeting, which is where this was all hashed out, there are two votes that relate to this. The first one is the motion to uphold the level 4 discipline, removing Yi-Min Lin's range officer certification. And this one was, so Bruce Gary, Area 1, was absent with notice. Ted Murphy abstained because he has a conflict of interest, because the outcome will make him president or not. And of everybody else, there were 5 yes votes, including Scott Arnberg, which I haven't talked to Scott. I don't know what his justification behind it was. I'm guessing, so this vote was taken at 11:30 at night. I'm guessing, and this was at the end of, I think, the third meeting on this topic. I'm guessing it was probably there's no way to salvage this. Let's just vote it and get it over with. And so he voted yes just to move on, I'm guessing. So he voted yes. Frank Rizzi, Area 7, voted no. So it ended up being 5-1 yes, the motion passed. But then immediately after that, Scott Arnberg made a motion to amend the time period in the previous motion to allow Yi-Min Lin to petition the board of directors prior to December 31st, 2023 for possible reinstatement of his range officer certification on December 31st, 2023. So, and again, Scott made this motion. So he voted yes on the previous one, but then he makes this motion. Everybody votes yes for this, except, weirdly, Bruce Wells. I guess Bruce Wells did not want him to even have the chance to be reinstated. Do with that what you will. But basically, the way I read these minutes are Scott and the rest of the board, they were deadlocked. They couldn't get a way out. And so they just said, okay, we're going to suspend your certification. But my understanding is if Yi-Min were to win, he could apply to the board and ask to be reinstated on December 31st, 2023. So that would make him technically eligible to serve. What is going to change? Why would the board that just was unwilling to come up with terms to allow him to regain his RO certification? What would change between now and the end of the year? Probably nothing. I mean, in the meantime, there will be a new interim Area 8 director appointed, presumably, for the 6 months of the year between now and when the new term would start. If it were up to me, given that Area 8 isn't going to go to a runoff, I would probably hold off on appointing someone and just make whoever wins the election, which we will know end of July, just appoint them as Area 8 and then just have them roll into that term. That way it's only a month and a half that we don't have an Area 8 director rather than having an interim for 6 months and then the new guy starts January 1st. That's what I would do because that seems like the best good faith outcome, which means it probably won't be what happens, but we'll see. I don't like the negative mind read. Maybe that is what ends up happening, but that Area 8 director would be the only thing that would change on the board between now and the end of the year. And so I don't really understand the scenario in which Yi-Min Lin, if he were elected, would be reinstated by this board that doesn't like him, that voted to get rid of him already. So if that doesn't happen, if he wins the election and he doesn't get reinstated, well, then January 1st, he is considered to have resigned, and boom, another presidential special election is triggered. So I mean, I've never been Yi-Min Lin's biggest fan. I don't know that I can really get behind voting for him just because this giant cloud hanging over his head of having to beg the board for his RO certification back, otherwise possibly triggering months more chaos, and they'd have to appoint a new vice president who would then become the new interim president. I mean, the whole thing would just be a freaking mess, and I don't feel comfortable steering people in that direction. I have seen the argument made that voting for Yi-Min is a way of sticking it to the man and giving a middle finger to the board. And to be totally honest, I don't think the idea of a protest vote or strategic voting of that kind in a secret ballot election works. Now, like I've said before on this podcast and in interviews, even if you in an open recorded roll call vote, even if you know you're going to lose 8-1, there's still something to be said in that non-secret ballot roll call vote for registering your disagreement. There's something to be said there. I'm not sure I really agree with that idea in the case of a secret ballot vote. Now, I'm not telling you who to vote for. If you want to vote for Yi-Min, by all means. I'm just saying this is the way I'm looking at it, and from my perspective, even if he gets 50% of the vote on the first ballot and there's no presidential runoff, then we're still back to the situation of he has to beg the board, which is probably not going to change between now and then, to give him his cert back. We'll see. But what I did want to talk about is people have been asking me either who am I voting for president, who would I recommend voting for president, and if I were in Area 8, who would I vote for? And as far as president goes, in the first round, without question, I personally am and have voted for Luigi Li. Part of that is definitely personal. I've known Luigi for a while. He has demonstrated good character. I believe in him. I think that he actually is an upstanding person who wants what's best for the sport, not just his personal gain or gaining power. I don't think he wants to do this any more than I particularly want to be running for area director. But he and I actually, we are on a similar wavelength. I enjoy talking to him. He and I agree on things generally, not on everything, but every conversation I've had with him has been enjoyable. He's a smart guy. And again, from my personal perspective, I have that personal relationship where I've known him for a while and I trust him. I think he would do a good job. I think he would stand up to the people that need standing up to. And I think he would be on board with changing things. I don't think he would just come in and try and keep all the secrecy and keep running everything for personal benefit. I don't think he would take kickbacks from manufacturers or anything like that. I also have to say he's stayed active in IDPA, Steel Challenge. He has traveled definitely more than any of the other candidates on the ballot. He has definitely traveled overseas to shoot IPSC matches, which is obviously very near and dear to my heart, because I do see USPSA as being a puzzle piece that fits into the larger whole of IPSC. Now, I do think there are rules that make sense to have exceptions or variants for USPSA because the US has a unique gun culture where, for example, things like open carry and concealed carry are actually a realistic thing where they aren't in most of the other countries in the world. So I don't, I'm not one of these people that says we should just throw away the USPSA rulebook and just adopt the IPSC rulebook wholesale. But I do think there are places where we can learn from them, where it makes sense to eliminate meaningless differences. Classic example, first one that comes to mind, why do we define our short courses or our medium courses now as up to 20 rounds, where an IPSC medium course is up to 24? Arbitrary, but just little things like that where what's the point of the difference except just because we're America and we want to be different? I don't know. I appreciate that fact that Luigi has shot internationally. He stayed active in IDPA. He is not just a one-trick pony in that sense. Like I said, he's very analytical. I think he and I have had a lot of interesting conversations. He sees things. He always brings a good perspective to any discussion that I've had with him. He's not just, well, this is the way I feel and this is the way it should be, and we're going to do it my way because that's what feels good. He definitely looks at things through an analytical lens, not just what feels good. And I will say, as a personal anecdote, he is also incredibly, I don't know if giving is the right word. He is incredibly self-sacrificing. The anecdote that comes to mind for this is I actually ended up splitting. So when I went down to Florida in January for the Pan American Extreme match, I knew he was local. I knew he was going to be shooting the match. And so I reached out to him and said, hey, are you organizing an Airbnb? Can I get a room? And he was like, yeah, sure. No problem. I'll get it taken care of. And so, sure enough, true to his word, picks out a spot. It's great. It's got a couple bedrooms. And as wouldn't you know it, as things got closer, I think originally there was supposed to be three of us splitting this 3-bedroom house. And as things got closer, guys kept hitting him up. And we'd already put the deposit down on this place. And he was just such a big-hearted guy that when the first guy came along and said, hey, do you have room? He was like, sure. And he volunteered to sleep on the couch at the Airbnb that he was organizing. He could have easily just said, no, man, we're full. Sorry. But he didn't. He said, by all means, come right in, take the bed. I'll sleep on the couch. And then we actually ended up having a fifth guy stay, and he slept on a cot in the pantry of all places. It was this little 3-bedroom Florida bungalow, but we made it work. But yeah, I was just amazed by that. And then even after all that, he was apologetic to me, and he was trying to give me some kind of like partial refund on what I had paid him because, the house was being split 5 ways instead of 3. And I was like, no, dude, you keep the money. You're having to sleep on the couch in your own Airbnb. You keep it. Like, I paid for a bed. I got a bed. We are square. No worries. And I actually, even with all that, on the last day of the match, I was a little bit squirrely. My ammo I had some ammo that I wasn't 100% confident in. And so he just hands me a box of 100 rounds case gauged. And he's just like, here, man, if you need this, take it. And the way things ended up working out, I didn't end up seeing him after the match. So I'm still carrying it. And I'm going to give it back to him. He's going to be in North Carolina for the section match. So Luigi, if you're listening to this, I got that box of ammo for you. I didn't touch it. But it was just one of those where it was not, hey, throw me a couple bucks. Here's some ammo. It was just, hey, here's someone in need. Take it. He's very unselfish. And I appreciate that. There's a certain generosity there that you can't fake. I mean, you just, and he had no idea any of this was coming. We talked briefly about, would he be interested in running for president, but he had no idea any of this was coming. He was just being a good dude to people in the sport. And are some of the other candidates in the election good dudes? Quite possibly. But I personally have that interaction. I know Luigi, and so he's the one I'm personally voting for. That said, I don't know Vince Lucchetti at all. I actually had never heard his name until 8 weeks ago, whenever he popped up as filing to run. But I will just say everything that I've heard from him has stuck out to me as something I can get on board with and nod my head with. He's been in the sport for 20 years. He was section coordinator in Western Pennsylvania, which Pennsylvania is one of those weird states where the state is so large and it's kind of split. You have a lot of clubs on one side, on the western side, and then you have a bunch of clubs over on the New Jersey eastern side. And So I guess they have split into two sections, and he was section coordinator of Western Pennsylvania. For a couple of years, he's listed as the assistant section coordinator. I don't know exactly what that means, but he's obviously still involved. So he's been on the Casual Shooter podcast as well as the Hit Factor podcast, and listening to both of those, just as he was talking, I was like, yes, this guy, he's paying attention to the right things. He's saying the right stuff. I think he and I are aligned. You know, if he were on the board and I were not, I would still want him to advocate for these things. And you know, I mean, just to name one thing that stuck out at me was the fact that on the Hit Factor podcast, he was having a discussion with Jeremy Reed, who, you know, is a big 1911 guy. That's his whole business. He makes custom 1911s. And so he has a love for that and the history of the 45 and major power factor and the legacy of that in the sport of IPSC and USPSA. And I have thoughts about that and where that should go, but I definitely appreciate the history and the fact that we shouldn't just go with whatever is easy or convenient or popular. And that's actually exactly where they got to in the discussion as well. And there was one section in particular that just struck me where, you know, Vince was saying we have to think about the values of the sport, not just what is popular. And I feel like that's something I've said on this podcast. I'd hope that that's a value that I've expressed. And so to me, hearing someone who looks at things through that lens, it just felt like a sort of kindred spirit, somebody who thinks along the same lines. But at the same time, he has a lot of organizational and financial experience that honestly I lack. I know that going in. To be totally honest, none of the three of us Area 6 candidates have that. None of us have been on the board of anything. The only exception being that Matt Hopkins was previously on the board of USPSA for 3 or 4 months. So he has a little bit of exposure to that, but Vince has been in all kinds of city and corporate and that kind of thing. And so he's got that perspective. And so as someone who can honestly evaluate my strengths and weaknesses, when I look at someone like Scott Arnberg, who has this financial background more developed than my own, and, you know, I look at someone like Vince, these are people that I would be happy to lean on. And so when I hear that and I see that, I think, okay, this is a guy who is aligned with what I think is good for the sport, and I would be happy to vote for him if I could. I can't, but for the people who have asked me, that's the way I would go. Vince, to me, from everything that I've heard, again, you can listen to, if you're on the fence, you can listen to his interview on the Hit Factor podcast with Jeremy Reed and Jeff Coughlin. You can listen to his interview on the Casual Shooters podcast. Both, I think, were interesting. Like, he's just an interesting guy to listen to. I appreciated the stuff that he had to say, and yeah, I think he would be good for the sport as well. So those are kind of my two ideas. If you want to vote for somebody else, we can still be friends. If you don't want to vote for me for Area 6, we can still be friends. This is not personal. This is just this in August of last year when the board started banning people for speech violations. That was sort of the last straw. And I thought, I've got to at least throw my hat in and try and make a difference. And, you know, if winning the election isn't the path that I'm supposed to take right now, that's fine. I'm not going to let it keep me up at night. I will find other ways to try and make things better. But I do think we are definitely at an inflection point moment for the sport where, between the finances being what they are and just the general reputation of USPSA, I think is at an inflection point. It could go either way. And I think if we still have time to turn things around, but if it's another year, 2 years, 3 years before we can start to make meaningful changes, then things may be too far gone to pull them back. So I do think this election is a particularly pivotal one. I think the fact that it is one of the most hotly contested in terms of total number of candidates on a ballot in years is very relevant. And so I would say, if you haven't voted already, definitely take your time, read through the candidate bios, seek out interviews. I mean, I will definitely say I found doing podcast interviews with other people, which is not something I'd really ever done before in the past. I do this kind of more produced, slow-paced, single-person format on my own. Doing that required me to think on my feet more and be more prepared. And I think in some ways, it also covers a wider swath of topics. And so honestly, if someone were curious, like, hey, who's this Ben Berry guy, rather than pointing them to my own podcast, which I think is sort of the deep end of the pool, if they want just a snapshot, I would point them to probably my interview, probably the Casual Shooters podcast one or the Training Group Live one. Those both stick out to me, but I mean, again, I think they're all, every single, I don't want to give short change to any of them. I appreciate Manny from Manny Talks Shooting and having me on. I appreciate Brian from Hunters HD Gold. That one actually just dropped this week. That one was that was actually the only one that I did in person. And it was fun. Like, it was just cool just getting to hang out and talk. And it really, every single one of these interviews that I did, it just felt like talking to friends and, getting to just kind of hash out the issues. But, Casual Shooters podcast, Manny Talks Shooting, Bullets and Bourbon with Matt Gunlock and Frank Gow, Raw Time Champ with the guys from Texas, Connor, Matt, and Calvin. And then I ended up doing a two-parter with Joel Park from Training Group Live. One was specifically about shooting and practicing and that sort of stuff, which was kind of cool because that's not something that any of the other interviews really talked about. And then the second half was politics and the election. And again, this is all on my website at berryshooting.com/area6. If you want to point someone to resources about me, and like I said, with Vince, I know he did an interview with Casual Shooters and Hit Factor. And actually, now that I say that, I'm realizing I left Matt Hopkins and I did a joint interview debate thing on the Hit Factor podcast as well, and I'll add that to the list on my podcast page. So yeah, if anybody's curious about me, that's sort of the one-stop shop, berryshooting.com/area6. And I will say, if we look back, it's hard to really compare apples to apples because this was so long ago. But if we pull up the results of the last Area 6 election, so this was in December of 2015. At the time, they list basically 22,000 eligible members that were mailed ballots. So that's probably increased by half. So it's probably, that number plus 50%. Now of eligible voters, 33,000 probably of the 36,000 members, whatever that is. But the Area 6 runoff, which came down to two candidates, was the difference of 58 votes, 549 to 607. So 58 votes swung that. If we scale that to current numbers, assuming USPSA's numbers have scaled with Area 6, that's 75 votes, 80 votes. So, proportionally, again, assuming that things are as evenly matched as they were, which who knows, maybe that'll be the case, maybe it won't. But the total number of people that voted in the 2015 Area 6 election was less than 1,200, and the dividing, the thing that made the difference was 58 votes. And so this year it'll probably be something like 1,800, 2,000 maybe, if we're sort of adjusting those numbers up by 50%, 60%. And the margin very well could be 50, 75, 100 votes. And so if you feel passionate about this, if you feel like this is something that you are motivated to change, you have a whole month. So, you'll basically, if you go to a monthly match anytime between now and a month from now, all your monthly matches will happen at least once. And so if you want to talk to people on your squad, talk to people before and after, just say, hey, have you looked at who you're voting for? Do you have any idea? Do you have any thoughts? And if they don't know anything about me, point them to that berryshooting.com/area6 page. And obviously all the candidate bios for the presidential election, those are all on the USPSA website. And they did like 20 to 30 minute podcasts with each candidate, but they just read the same questionnaire questions, and some candidates improvise answers and some just read off their prepared answers. So, I mean, you can take those for what they're worth. It's not terrible listening. It's definitely somewhat condensed, but there are a fair number of them. But there's definitely information out there. This election will be decided by relatively small margins, all things considered, quite likely, especially the runoffs. So don't take that for granted. If you can personally get one or two more people to cast a vote, they're roughly, each episode of this podcast gets roughly 800 downloads, 900 maybe. So that could add up. But I hate being a politician and telling people, rah, rah, vote for me. But if everything that I've said makes sense to you, if you think that I would be a good representative for what you think would be good in the sport going forward, I would be happy to have your vote. Well, that wraps up this episode of Short Course. My email is ben@berryshooting.com. Talk to you next time.